Hey everybody, welcome to the 124th episode of the JDO show. I am your host, J. David Osborne, and today on the show we have Jeff Jackson. Jeff is the author of Destroy All Monsters, which recently came out from FSG Originals. He is also the author of Mira Corpora, one of my favorite books of all time, and its companion piece, Novi Sad. Jeff is a playwright, a musician, and an author, and an all-around really cool guy who thinks pretty deeply about this kind of stuff. It's been really cool to see the kind of praise that Destroy All Monsters has been getting. It's been covered in the New York Times and the Washington Post and on every social media feed that I'm subscribed to. I enjoyed it a lot. Jeff and I have a really cool conversation here. If I can brag a little bit, he sent me an email afterwards saying that this conversation had his head spinning a day later, which I think is good. I hope that that's from the fact that it was really thought-provoking and not because most of the time I am an incoherent ass. Anyway, I hope you enjoy it. I really enjoyed it. I always have fun talking to Jeff. I would do it for not podcast-related reasons. Pick up his book, Destroy All Monsters. It really is good. I mean, we get into, I guess a little bit later in the podcast, we get a little bit into spoiler territory, but if you haven't read it, go read it first and then come back and listen to this, unless you don't mind a little light spoilage. But as Jeff mentions kind of early on in the talk, it's a really hard book to spoil. So without further ado, please do enjoy this 124th episode of the JDO show with Jeff Jackson. And it's thinking, and it has thought. All right, hey Jeff, thank you for coming on the JDO show.
Hey, it's great to be here. It's always a pleasure.
Yeah, same here, same here. So Destroy All Monsters came out a few months ago. What was the exact date? I do my research here.
October 16th it came out.
My little brother's birthday.
Oh,
So
nice.
so far it seemed to have gotten a really, really great reception. You want to talk a little bit about what that experience has been like, and then we'll talk about the book.
Yeah, it's been it has so far it has had a great reception. It's been a little discombobulating for a writer coming from a small press to get reviews in places like the Washington Post and the LA Times and the New York Times and
Mm-hmm.
NPR. Um, it's been really nice, and they've been very thoughtful, generous reads, and it's a challenging book, and it's been great that it feels like the reviewers have been um, I don't know, really sensitive and perceptive about the book, and I've been really fortunate with that.
That's
And
awesome.
yeah, it's interesting, like being in Charlotte, North Carolina, not a very literary town, let's say.
Mm-hmm.
While all
Right,
this,
right.
while all this is happening, it does sort of feel I do feel a little disconnected from it all, and maybe in a good way, actually.
Mm-hmm.
It
So have
hasn't like a number on my head the way it might have been if I were like living in New York, say.
Sure, yeah. Do you think that it's going to affect you going forward? Because now that the book seems to be pretty well received, um, actually, now that I think about it, I'm asking that question, and it's like, oh yeah, that's a great idea, dude. Put into Jeff's head this idea that now he needs to be psyched out because this book is doing
No, no,
well.
no. It actually is. I'd say it's on the opposite because it's actually reinforced everything I thought about this book,
Cool.
which um, is that it's not too weird, that there's an audience for it, and that readers would like it because it took. I mean, when I initially showed this book to my original agent, um, she dropped me after she read it.
No way, really?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. The initial reaction was that she was like, "This is. I'm not going to send this out." And
Because
if
it
you
was too violent or too weird, or what was the
She
reasoning?
just didn't like. No, she just didn't like it. She said this represents. It was just she just didn't like it. It just was not for her, and she just didn't see this as my next book. And so we parted ways, and it took me almost a year to find another agent.
Hmm.
And then and then there were over 30 rejections before FSG actually came back around and got it.
Oh wow, That
So
must have been.
I've been hearing so much about this book that it's too weird, that there isn't an audience, that it's too challenging, all these sort of different things. So actually, the success of it has just sort of emboldened me to want to do even stranger things.
Oh, that's so good to hear, because coming from a perspective of a person who may be a little bit weird, I'll cop to that. I honest, and this isn't a slam. I didn't really think it was that weird of a book either. I mean,
Well, I mean, I think one of my favorite interviews actually was at Lit Hub, where the first question was, they said, "This book is both your most accessible and your most experimental book. Agree or disagree?" And I was like, "Yes, agree, strongly agree." And I think that like that's exactly right. Like it's sort of been Trojan horsed
mm-hmm,
to be to to be to meet the reader where they are and to be like a really propulsive story.
sure.
But I think also at some of like the deeper levels of the book, it's actually weirder than Mira Corpora or Novi Sad. And in fact, when the book was bought, it was just bought based on the A side.
Hmm.
And
Interesting.
I talked the publisher into adding the B side.
Hmm. Now what? Now I'm trying to kind of pull that apart as it being more. I know formally it's probably a bit more experimental. I'm thinking maybe in terms of. I mean, you go more into the sort of like to my mind. This might be way off track from what we're talking about right now, but to my mind, each of your books from Mira Corpora to Novi Sad to this one, you seem to be getting more and more focused on architecture and its decay, right? It seems like every book
Huh.
gets more and more. There are a bunch of passages in Destroy All Monsters that deal with kind of characters walking through abandoned ruins. And it feels like, and it's been a while since I've read Mira Corpora, so I could be off base on this, but it seemed to me that that was probably more about like the body, obviously. Like it was more about the corporeal degradation, if you will. And then Novi Sad, and then this one seemed to be much more about characters' environments falling apart around them. I
Why
don't.
there's a lot of broken down buildings in Mira Corpora too, but I think because it's written in the first person,
Uh huh. Uh huh.
that's a little less foregrounded. So maybe it's sort of like with each of these three books, the camera pulls back a little bit further
Yeah. Yeah. That's a
so that
fair. Yeah.
you're noticing the architecture a little bit more. But there's also like there's I mean, Industrial Monsters, there's a lot of the woods and forests and things like that too.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. But there is a lot. There is a lot of lovingly kind of rendered. I'm thinking one of my favorite passages in the book is when a character is walking through this sort of abandoned rock hall, right? And it's very. I was reading it, I think, along the same time that I'd started reading Mark Fisher's work.
Oh
Um,
yeah, this stuff is great.
yeah, and so Mark Fisher talks. Obviously, he writes wrote rather a lot about music, but he also wrote a lot about this concept called hauntology, right? Which is, I believe, from Derrida, and it's this kind of hauntology is the feeling of nostalgia for a future that will never happen. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's. I think it partly comes. He's actually partly taking the term, at least in terms of musical, from Simon Reynolds,
Oh yes,
who
yes,
wrote
yes.
an article for The Wire about hauntology and about this electronic music label called Ghostbox.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I think he and Mark Fisher were both sort of like obsessed with this idea, which or Simon Reynolds at least sort of traces back first to sort of the early Boards of Canada records and sort of goes from there. But yeah, it's definitely infused with Derrida and all that stuff.
And well, the stuff that I read with, interestingly enough, this is probably just fresh on my mind because I was listening to Burial this morning, which is
Oh yes.
it was an oddly cloudy day in El Paso, and whenever it's cloudy, I'm like, it's time to throw on Burial. Um, but
I've gone down the burial wormhole recently too.
it's great stuff, right? A kind of interesting thing, a little tidbit, neither here nor there, but the software that he used, at least on his earlier albums, he didn't use kind of computer. I guess I'm gonna mess this up. Kind of sequencers, right?
Hmm.
So basically, what that did was that every once in a while his beats would be slightly off, and it added this kind of like organic feel to this techno music. I just thought that was pretty cool because it was like the program meant that he had to I guess, record himself live hitting a button in order to make it
Oh,
work.
yeah.
You see what I'm
Yeah.
saying? Like,
Totally. I get
yeah.
it. Yeah. No, that's great.
But anyway, yeah, that hauntology stuff, I don't know why, but like that felt that in Destroy All Monsters too. There's this
Sure.
kind of like a melancholy thing, but it's melancholy for not just sort of, these days when, these kind of young people who used to be, so young and artsy and into the music, but also just this kind of like there is this destruction of a future because of the nature, I guess, of the is it, it's not really ever clear why what's happening is happening, right?
I mean, different characters in the book have different opinions
Mm-hmm.
about why this is happening, but
Mm-hmm.
the book isn't positing a solution. They're just different theories being bandied about.
Right, right. Did you ever feel like that you wanted to give an answer, or did you know from the beginning you're like, oh no, that's not the way I'm going with this?
I knew pretty early on that wasn't the way I was going with it. Like, I wasn't even sure there is an answer.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I think there are. I mean, it's just sort of like with a lot of violence in society. There's a lot of theories floating around, but it's not like everyone drank this fluoridated water and suddenly that's what caused them to you know pick up an AK.
Right.
So in that sense, I definitely didn't, because then it becomes sort of also a more traditional somehow sci-fi mystery or something.
Right. Right.
And I just wanted to keep the possibilities in play in a way that felt just more real to me.
Mm-hmm. Well, and it is more real too, because like you said, I mean, real gun violence. There's tons of reasons. There's never one kind of thing. Something that I notice on social media, and it is kind of sad how it's become just sort of, it seems like another thing that happens during a week, but after there'll be some sort of mass shooting, it's almost like it is like a song being played at a certain point that you've heard before, because everybody comes in to play their part, and it's like, okay, it's probably not that, it's probably not that, no, we probably don't need more guns, no, you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
it's just this kind of on and on. But I sort of asked that question because you and I were talking a bit about how authors shouldn't maybe necessarily do that, and by do that I mean have this kind of authorial, top down, this is what a book is about kind of thing. I'm very indelicately trying to segue in that conversation that we were having about 10 minutes
Sure,
ago.
sure.
But
Yeah, no, and I agree with that. Like, I mean, for me, there's a couple of things. I mean, one, I always think about these books as sort of being like open texts in
mm-hmm.
terms of like allowing readers like the maximum room, hopefully, to have their own sort of interpretations about what's happening, and
Mm-hmm.
even to have their own feelings about what's happening. And there may be certain, I mean, I think there are definitely certain moments in all the books where I've run across readers who've had radically different feelings about like very specific moments, about these same specific moments.
Mm-hmm.
And I also think like it's really important to assume that the readers are bringing their own morality to the text.
Yes,
I
right.
mean, I mean, it's just sort of respecting the reader. I mean, one of my favorite writers is this Russian writer, Isaac Babel, and he wrote these great stories, the Red Cavalry stories. And he actually he was Jewish, and he traveled with the Cossacks who were,
Hmm.
sort of carrying out this pogrom. And they didn't know he was Jewish. He was undercover. And he writes these really like horrific stories from the Cossack point of view, often forcing you to sort of find the humanity in the characters that are being victimized, because he really believed that sort of like an easy empathy did nothing for anyone. And so he really sort of forces you as a reader to hold on to your morality and your ethics and wrestle with the story to sort of find where the real humanity in the story is. And I think actually Dennis Cooper does something really similar with his books
Mm-hmm.
too,
Mm-hmm.
where he really sort of like he's forcing you to to bring your own moral compass to the books. Nabokov does that some as well, and I think it's an interesting. I think it's like a really respectful point of view for a writer to take to his or her reader.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And it makes me think of, and I guess we kind of decided that maybe this axis wasn't quite right, but there's sort of a y-axis and an x-axis here, right? And there's and it's the relationship between, you know, an author and his audience, right? And this vertical top-down one gives you the idea of the author as a sort of a sage giving down, like you had said, Moses giving the 10 Commandments, right? This is, I'm going to give you sort of a gift wrapped new morality, right? That you can then sort of unpack and you can try it on and you can see how it works, right? But it's much more interesting to think of it in a horizontal way, where, like you said, I love the idea of the reader bringing their own morality to a work and interacting with it in such a way that they may or may not come away changed, but they're engaging with it. It's not a passive activity, right?
Yeah, I mean, reading should be a collaboration. I think like as a technology, the only thing that books have over sort of films and video games and some of these other sort of more immediate forms, music, is that like you have to like jam it in your brain.
Yeah.
And it's a slow process. Like you have to like page by page cram it into your head.
Mm-hmm.
And when you're being told basically not just what to think, but also how to feel, to me, like ethically, that's like another form of like control mechanism.
Mm-hmm.
And like you can have all the sort of like woke content you want in a book, but if you're still stage managing how people, you know, their emotions and how they should feel through certain moments in your story, you're still enacting the same repressive control mechanism that you're supposedly, you know, railing against. And, you know, to me, it's like this sort of, it's actually this control mechanism at this level that really needs to be dismantled. And it's something that I think fiction and books can powerfully do.
Oh, I couldn't agree with you more. That's so cool to hear you say that. Yeah, because especially in these trying times where we have broken down into what are called, you know, mimetic tribes. There's this really great article recently about how in the past 5 or 6 years or so, it stopped being left and right, and we have splintered off into all these different tribes, basically based on what we very specifically believe. So it's less about giving people what the giving them the meme plexes that the mimetic tribe demands. And it's almost like now books, in a sense, are, if you think of this kind of landscape, right, of hunter-gatherer meme tribes, right? It's almost like a tribe comes upon, you know, this sort of totem, this you know, like Kubrickian monolith that they then, you know, interact with, and it forces them to put their thought process like onto this thing. And there's this, you know, I'm picturing now this huge psychedelic dance that these two things are doing together. But the idea of book as challenge has always kind of been what does separate books from the rest of the kind of quote unquote entertainment mediums. Now, not always, obviously. There are difficult films to get through and there are difficult records to listen to, but books really, I mean, they're physically heavy sometimes, right? I mean, they're pretty intimidating things. So I think that, you know, maybe sometimes I'll see on social media these kind of, I guess, back and forth about whether books should challenge or whether they should be entertaining. And it's like, ¿por qué no los dos? Why not both, right? Like,
sure, absolutely.
You can do both. But I guess I say all that to say that, I guess I'm saying that to diffuse this idea. Like, I'm not trying to say that books shouldn't be entertaining, but books as challenging objects is really is lighting me up right now, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an important role that I think books can play, and I think it's also radical when we realize how often the entertainment that we consume is like every sort of beat has been tested for us.
Right.
And to encounter something that leaves a more open field, whether it's a book or a movie or what, you know, music or whatever, that's not just trying to press your buttons in a way that it knows is going to work, is is a pretty radical act these days, I think.
Right, right. It's just like, yeah, it's like the anti-Lifetime movie. Hold on one second. Hey, dog. I know you like butt scratches a lot, and that's cool. I love you too, but I need you to go lay down. Thanks so much. Sorry, my dog is just like pressing herself into me, like, Father, why are you talking into this strange machine? I'm right in front of you. Uh, but no, yeah, and I just, it makes me think too about a lot of kind of experimental writers, I guess, for lack of a better term. This year, I really got into them heavy, right? Um, People, have you read like Gary Shipley or I'm sure you've read Blake Butler, right?
Oh, sure. I've read a lot of Blake Butler. I
Right.
haven't read Gary Shipley, no.
Gary Shipley's an English dude, I believe, who is in not very similar to Blake at all, but just it's the same kind of very like complex, difficult, kind of gross writing.
Hmm.
So I feel like your writing is interesting because it's doing some of the same things that these other guys are doing, but like you said, it does seem that you have um, maybe a little bit more of a focus on characters. So you're getting a little bit of both worlds, right? Like there are these kind of complex experimental things moving through it, but then I promise I'm getting to a question. But so basically, it seems like all of that is anchored in your particular artistic um, obsessions. Maybe do you feel that when you're writing, you have particular things that you keep coming back to?
I mean, they keep appearing on the page, so yeah, I'd say so. I mean, sometimes I think like, oh, this is so new, and then I think back, I'm like, oh my God, it's just like the same.
Yeah.
Um, but that's fine. I mean, I do think I'm more interested in character, and I'm more interested in a propulsive sort of narrative than someone like Blake, say,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
where I think like although a lot of our underlying concerns are very, very similar.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and that stuff is in my work because I'm interested in how you can sort of do like both and
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
like how you can have that character stuff happening, how you can have some of the plot stuff happening that I mean it's been nice that a lot of people have told me like they've read this book in one or two sittings or something like that and it's sort of engineered to work that way. Um, and that's nice. Uh, but yeah, I mean, a lot of the same obsessions definitely come out and from book to book. And sometimes I try not to fight them. I mean, I always think back about like the J.G. Ballard thing about he talked
Yes.
about like writing his obsessions until they didn't have any power anymore. And when I was a younger writer, I was always trying to like from story to story like reinvent the wheel because I thought like I've used it up in that past story and it has to all be fresh. And once I just got rid of that idea, the writing became so much better
Yeah.
and had much more power because I was plugged into something that I really cared about or subconsciously like really sort of lit me up. Um, and I don't know, as long as there are enough obstacles that I'm still pushing against something, that stuff still has power and I think hopefully still feels new and not too repetitive for people who've read more than one of my books.
I don't think so. I think that something I can't remember where I heard it, but it's very much along the lines of what you're saying. Where one of the tricky things about being an artist, specifically a writer, is that you're not only fighting against this idea of trying not to repeat yourself from book to book, but we also get it in our head that we're not allowed to do variations on any kind of themes either. So we have to stay away from what's been done by everybody else too, and that leads to gigantic writer's block.
Yeah, it's just no way to be. Yeah,
No, no.
I mean, yeah, it's better to I think the best thing is to, for me, what turned out to be a real turning point was sort of figuring out what my obsessions really were and sort of turning down the noise in my head around what everyone else was interested in
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
and figuring out what I was actually interested in because I for a long time it was really hard to distinguish my own obsessions from the obsessions I thought I should be having.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, what do you mean, like the obsessions that you should be having? Like, what's an example
I,
of
I
that?
mean, I mean, I mean by like, what are a lot of other people writing about? What seems to be in the air that seems cool and interesting? What just sort of following other artistic ideas that were cool, but they weren't necessarily, and they were interesting to read about and think about, but weren't necessarily at the core of what really excited me.
Which was
And
what?
so, um, I don't know, man. There are three books. I guess my answer would be to hand you one right now. I'd be handing you one book at a time, very slowly. Like
Right, right, right. These,
here are these obsessions.
yes,
Um,
things falling apart. There's one.
Ritual.
Ritual, yeah, ritual is a big
Ritual.
one.
Does ritual and the question: does ritual have power if you don't believe in it?
Hmm.
Does ritual have power outside of your belief in it? And
Mm-hmm.
if so, what is that power?
Mm-hmm.
And if not, why keep returning to the rituals?
Mm-hmm.
Um, Music, for sure. I mean, in some ways, writing Destroy All Monsters was sort of an attempt to like write about music head on and try and flush it all out of my system,
Mm-hmm.
um, which didn't work. Spoiler alert. So, that's definitely one. I mean, stuff around the body is definitely another. Um, Grief would be one, probably.
Mm-hmm.
Funerals, that somehow goes under ritual.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I mean, honestly, some of these things, like I'm on a need to know basis with myself about these
Yes.
things.
Oh, perfect. Yeah.
Like I really don't want to know. A friend of a friend who's a psychoanalyst, like he read Miracle Poor and offered to do an analysis session with me so he could tease out so I could understand exactly what sort of motivated my writing. And I was like, hell no. Like, why would I want to do that? That sounds terrible.
Right. Right. No, and I do think that ritual is an exact, like, a ritual is a definite. It's kind of sort of against all that, right? Um, I think that, well, first of all, to answer your first kind of obsession thing with ritual, I do think ritual works, and I don't know why either. Um, there's a recent book called The Power of Eight, right? And it's kind of self-helpy. Not sure. I think it might be like sort of like a Christian self-help book. Um, but they did a study about prayer, for example, and they did studies on patients who I think were sick with cancer, and they had 8 people pray for one person who was dying to get better, and the other person was the control group. I'm not sure. Now that I think about it, I'm not sure if this was the most ethical study, uh, but it ended up, I guess, over the course of a bunch of these different studies, it turns out that in some small way, praying for people, like the people who got prayed for, did get better. Um, so there's that.
Yeah, I mean, there may be, I don't know. I don't know whether there's something about the energy you put into something, some act or whatever that is, but it's, yeah, I don't know. It's something I actually ended up being surprised I was so interested in.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It,
Yeah.
it started coming out a lot in the writing, and I realized, oh, this is something that's really, and then it started coming out in the theater pieces I was doing and other things like that. And
Oh, that's true. Yeah, your sleep one. That's that whole thing is
well,
a ritual.
that is, but the one after that's even more so because the one after that's called Vine of the Dead, and it was about trying to contact the director's dead mother.
Whoa. How did I not hear about this? That's awesome.
Yeah, so the director who I work with, Jim Finley, he's like a hardcore materialist atheist, or at least at that point was, and he really felt like the one thing that was sort of his vulnerability. His mother died when he was like 18 or 19, was wanting to hear from his mother.
Mm-hmm.
That's
Mm-hmm.
really sort of like the only thing from the other side he wanted to hear from,
Mm-hmm.
and he really felt like that. So that's where he wanted to sort of press in, was on that vulnerability. Um, and so we started working with a voodoo priestess
Okay.
about doing some rituals, and she dropped the project because she could vouch for the safety of the performers, but she couldn't vouch for the safety of the audience, and she felt it was unethical to move forward.
Wow, that's so interesting. Did you see any? So there were rehearsals then for this?
There were some rehearsals. There was some work done with her. She's a very nice person, and there were some things that she and the director started to conjure up that were, I think, troubling to her and slightly troubling to the director
Can
as
you
well.
can you go into any? Is it personal stuff? Can't really
It is
talk about it.
personal, but actually, we ended up folding a lot of this into the show,
Okay.
which was interesting because the sort of rituals we sort of ended up the way we ended up sort of solving this. So the idea of the Dream of the Red Chamber, which was a play for a sleeping audience, like we literally had 50 beds, and we invited the audience to come and take a nap or, in fact, sleep all night through the piece. And this sort of the crux of that piece was really about getting at like the transaction in theater is like the actor will do something interesting, and because of that you will pay attention as an
Mm-hmm.
audience member. And we were like, what happens if you break that bond?
Mm-hmm.
What comes out of that? And
Right,
so
right, right.
with Vine of the Dead, what we were really looking at was like, what if it's not actually a theater piece? What if it's a ritual?
Hmm.
What if we really get to like sort of the lie at the heart of theater and really try and like poke into that and expose that and live in that place where like, is this a ritual or is this theater?
Hmm. What is
um,
what do you think that the distinction between those two is?
well, I think it's a fine line for sure. I mean, we were really trying though initially, the initial impulse was to involve this woman who had a voodoo practice. I shouldn't actually call her a voodoo priestess. That's not accurate.
Okay.
She had her own sort of spiritual practice that involved this sort of spiritual technology. And it was really the idea was that we would do it. We would do a couple of performances, but they would be this ritual. And if contact was made, the show was over.
Hmm.
And if contact was made, we never do the show again.
Between him and his
It's just
mother.
so the idea was to actually do a ritual and then find some way to maybe theatricalize a little bit of it, but to really like to do an actual ritual before an audience. But that actually didn't work.
Mm-hmm.
That didn't work out for various reasons. And yeah, so I mean, one of the things that happened was um, the director and this woman, the spiritual practice, were doing these sort of freehand drawings. They had done a little ritual, and they started drawing a lot about bees, and they went and bought some honey, and just this kept coming back. And right when they were doing this, the director's daughter was on this field trip just outside of New York City,
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
she and her these other third graders were attacked by a swarm of bees.
Whoa. Yeah.
And this had never happened before. There's like not known to be a lot of bees out there, and like literally the swarm like chased these kids and their camp counselor for like 10 minutes and stung a lot of the kids. And
That's crazy. That is so interesting. Yeah. Well, I think I've heard somewhere that in a way, I guess that is kind of making contact because once the synchronicities start, that's when contact has been made. I
well,
guess.
she's like, yeah. So the way the woman explained it to us was that you're going to find all sorts of ways to talk about how this isn't what it is,
Mm.
but like it's going to keep happening. Once you've sort of opened this portal, it can keep happening. And she's like, it's much easier to invite spirits that are very harmful because those are happy to come across. And it's very, very difficult to coax out spirits that might be helpful to you because they're very wary and understand that it usually doesn't end well and it's very frustrating. Anyway, we really thought that we could sort of a solution would be to sort of hide the ritual in a box from the audience, and
Hmm.
this ritual would happen, and that way we'd sort of protect the sacredness of it, and that way it wouldn't be sort of giving away any secrets or anything like that. And the woman explained to us, she said, no, it actually works the exact opposite. She said, the more you hide it, the less power you have over it.
Right. Right.
The more transparent you make it, the more you can control it.
That kind of sounds like the fact that when they try to do studies of psi effects on people, it's there's this correlation between people actually having a belief in psi effect and them having, a statistical likelihood above probability to actually be able to enact a psi effect, right? And it sounds like mumbo jumbo. It sounds like, well, if you don't believe, then it just won't happen. But that seems to be exactly what happens. So if you, like you said, like if you hide it, if you don't have that kind of belief energy going into the ritual itself, the ritual kind of won't work. It's this interesting catch-22 thing, right?
Yeah, no, it is, and we ended up for that show like not. We ended up creating a series of art rituals, is what sort of what we called them,
Mm.
and sort of talked about the process of having made this show, of having found a witch on Tinder to try and come channel voices for us in our space.
Mm.
And things like this sort of process that we went through. But it was a long enough show that it really ended up actually really breaking down the performers. And the director was also one of the performers, one of the main performers. And interesting things started to happen just because of the ritualized nature of the show itself. And that's exactly where you had asked before, like, what's the difference between a ritual and theater? And like, our show is definitely trying to sort of collapse that as much as we could without doing something that was an actual ritual, or what the ritual that we believed in that we were doing was making this theater piece.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But a lot of it, like you said too, like it depends on sort of the belief, and sort of like the woman had said to us, like you can look at it from different ways, but you can from a and pretend it's not happening, but in
Mm-hmm.
other from another viewpoint, it is happening. And that was actually something I was playing with in Destroy All Monsters too, because there's sort of a supernatural element floating through that book,
Right.
or possibly floating through the book, depending on what angle you want to look at it from.
Well, now that you talk about ritual, now I'm kind of recontextualizing the almost the entire book as, itself being a case of a clash of a lot of different rituals, right? And rituals themselves standing in for almost supernatural, like you said, supernatural forces. So that's interesting that you brought that up, because there is this very sort of almost not even cult like, I don't want to use that word, but there is a ritual aspect to the shooters, right? Like
Sure.
it's very kind of methodical. They become sort of like obsessed. They have that sort of shooter look about them,
Yeah.
right?
Although some of them have knives and bombs too, just to complicate things a little bit. But
Oh,
yes, the
right.
killers.
Right, the killers. Yeah, exactly. So it's just like, so it does kind of strike me as like, when I was first reading, I was thinking of, music itself sort of, we've developed this kind of mutation that has made it so that, kind of like you were saying, exactly how you didn't want it perceived, it's something in the water, or, when there's
Right,
no
right.
more room left in hell, people are going to murder rock bands, right?
Yeah.
But now definitely, it's making me think more about it in terms of ritual, I
Well,
suppose.
musical performances themselves are a form of
Of
ritual.
course they are. Yeah, extremely potent ritual too, right?
Can be, can
Yeah.
be,
Mm-hmm.
can be a very potent form of ritual for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so there's definitely that, that as well. Um, and yeah, just the act of singing in front of someone, the sort of ritual getting up of doing that. There's also the sort of funeral in the book, that sort of ritual, the several funerals in the book, or
Mm-hmm.
the
Mm-hmm.
burying of the ashes of one of the characters.
Right. Right. I almost said it. Nah, don't do that. No spoilers. Okay.
It's a hard book to spoil, though. I don't know.
It kind of is. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I do think the whole kind of Florian arc is a really interesting part of the book, right? This kind of. Well, Can I ask? Do you have a preference between side A and side B?
Not really. It's interesting because initially there was just a side A for the book.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
And as it took a long time to find a new agent and try and get this book out into the world, they sort of really became obsessed with the idea of the book being like a cassette or an
Uh huh.
old vinyl single. And I started to think, like, what's the B side? What's the B side? Um, and initially, when I was writing it, I thought it might be something more like Novi Sad that could sort of stand on its own and sort of be published separately if it needed to.
Mm-hmm.
And that was sort of how I justified, like, taking this book that was already hard to sell and making it twice as difficult. Or that, I mean, which I don't think is actually true, but that's like what friends told me. They're like, "Are you insane? Like, what are you doing?"
Yeah, yeah.
Um, and when I finished the B side, I really, after and sat with it for a little while, I really realized that like the two things together actually made the whole book. And I was in a way like so grateful that the book had had such a hard time getting into the world because it gave me the time to do the B side, which wouldn't have happened otherwise.
That's funny.
So I was really thankful in an odd way that it had this sort of tortured path into the world because I mean, FSG bought the book, and 2 weeks before that, I had just done a final polish on the B side,
So they bought it knowing that the B side existed. Oh, it was kind of.
but never having read it,
Oh, okay, cool. Well, that's
and not
no
and
pressure.
initially having very little interest in it until they read it.
Right, right, right. Oh yeah, because it is great too. That's where it is what ties the whole book together. Now that you mention it, if it was just side A, I don't.
Well, I do think so. Here's the thing that's interesting about this, as I found, is that when there is just side A, the last chapter in side A takes a much greater weight. And I think that you sort of
Yeah,
see in the last chapter of side A, the culling of the deer becomes much more clearly sort of a reinscribing of the epidemic.
sure, sure.
And it's sort of like, and you sort of see that last chapter in some ways like replaying the rest of the book
Okay.
from this odd way. But when there's just side A, you sort of like, I think you're looking for like, why the hell is he ending here?
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
there's a side B, you're just sort of like, I'm going to flip it over and find out, so it is interesting. I think that like the stress falls in different places because they're two parts now.
Right, right. That is
Um,
interesting. I wonder if anybody reads it B to A.
Few people who have, and even weirder than that. So initially, I thought you could read it B to A, and I think you can. It's designed so that you can, but it should only be read side B first for people who really like conceptual work, who
Mm-hmm.
don't need any sort of character development initially,
Right.
and are happy to be disoriented.
That makes a lot of sense.
And
Yeah.
there are readers who would, I think, really enjoy reading it, but there are less of them than they think they are.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
If that makes sense. So, like, it definitely, I think, for like 95% of people, probably even myself included, it's better read side A first to side B. There's some people who've told me, three different people have told me they read a chapter in side A, then turn it over, read a chapter in side B, and keep doing that and try and read into the middle.
That's interesting because at a certain, I mean, side B is much shorter. So
It's insane, actually, I think. But
yeah, that's crazy behavior.
I take no responsibility for anything you get or don't get out of reading it that way.
Right, 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 right. Yeah, no, that's wow, now I'm thinking about all the different ways. You had mentioned, and this is something that I geek out on a lot about how the kind of presentation of the book, it's you called it designed to be read that way, or not designed to be read that way, but designed to be read in a propulsive way, so
Yeah.
that you could get your Jeff Jacksonisms in there and still keep everybody on board, right? And it
Yes.
is interesting, like the things that they do on this with the different colors of the pages and the different fonts, right? And there's a lot of white space. I've been thinking about this a lot because this is something that I try to do now with most of my books, both the ones that I write and publish. I try to include a lot of white space because I think that acts as a mental sort of breather. You don't feel so kind of hemmed in by all the text. So it's not really a question, I guess. I'm just
Well, I mean,
saying that.
it's all the design is all except for the gray pages is all following the way I laid it out in Word.
Oh, really?
Yes,
Interesting.
that was all. I spent a lot of time doing that. I spent a
Interesting.
lot of time figuring that out. It's interesting because sometimes I found, and this was a surprise, that sometimes a solution to like a plot problem or a character issue was actually layout and
Oh,
not textual.
interesting. Interesting. And what can you give me an example of that? That kind of stuff
Okay, so like
fascinates me.
so for instance, one of the things was like I was writing in third person for a lot of the book, and I just sort of felt like I really want to have these moments of how like we get into like I just want some get into the character's head briefly.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And how can I do that?
The birds, right? Yeah. Like the bird stuff.
No, no, not the bird stuff.
Hmm.
The throughout they're like little bits of first person bits of the character's thoughts
Oh,
that
right.
are
Of course. Yeah. Yeah.
italics that are sort of like centered in the middle of the page, that are
Mm-hmm.
in a slightly smaller font.
Right. Right.
And it was figuring out how that was laid out so that you could sort of dip into and dip out of it with almost like barely even realizing that's what you're getting.
Right.
It's like
Right.
all of a sudden like it's violating point of view and you're going into the character's head and you're getting one moment of their thinking. Sometimes it's also like I start to play around with that where sometimes these little thoughts are maybe other characters' thoughts
Mm-hmm.
or things that are just sort of floating through the air or like their fears being dramatized or something very briefly. And so like when I figured out how to lay that out and not in a way that didn't call too much attention to itself, like that answered so much of problems I had had about like how to how to write about these characters and their feelings without getting too close, but also not being too far away.
Mm-hmm. It always makes me a little bit uncomfortable with that kind of pop style of writing where you go directly into a character's head and you go from Stephen King does this all the time, but you go from somebody walking down the street and then it's all like, and then he thought, I wonder what I'm going to have for dinner today.
Oh
My
yeah,
my feet
yeah.
really hurt. But now that you mentioned that, that style of how you did it does kind of remind me of like silent film dialogue cards, you know, like where like it goes to black and then there's just like words on the screen. You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, yeah, no, I do, of course. Yeah,
Yeah.
but I think it's also I think the white space, hopefully, and sort of the way it's laid out. When it was more obtrusively laid out, it stopped you more, and it was
Mm-hmm.
really more about like hopefully not breaking your thought pattern, not breaking the rhythm too much,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and like figuring out how much space that was like a tricky thing.
Right. Right. So the number one thing, I think I told you this as soon as I read it. The number one thing that this did bring to mind was elephant. It kind of
Okay, now you mean the now which elephant?
Alan Clark, the Alan
Oh, good,
Clark
thank
elephant.
God.
Yeah, yeah. What's the other one?
It's a Gus Van Sant elephant.
That's literally the school shooter one, right?
And it's inspired by Alan Clark's elephant, but it's a pale, pale version.
Okay, well I have not seen that one.
Good, good. I'm so glad.
um,
Interestingly, you're the only person to have brought this up.
what really?
The only person to have brought this up. Now, my editor knew this because he's a big Alan Clark fan, but like literally, you're the only other person to have brought this up.
That I might just be lucky on that because I had watched I think This Is England, and then I just went down the rabbit hole, man, and I got
Well, I,
point.
I wrote about Alan Clark for the fanzine, so I was sort of at length. So I was sort of surprised that like it didn't come up.
Yeah. You know
Like,
what? No, I might be wrong. I think it might have been you writing about it for the fanzine that made me watch Elephant. Yeah, no, it was that's very interesting. I think it was you. I think it was that, and then I looked it up. But anyway, so Elephant is this film about what's it called? The Troubles, I
the
believe.
Troubles, yes,
Yeah,
in Northern Ireland, yeah.
just feels very Irish, right? Like just this hyper violent plague. It's like, oh, the Troubles. But yeah, so it's sequence after sequence after sequence of murder, basically. And
Yeah, so Alan Clark was apparently Alan Clark was the BBC gave him a commission to go make a narrative film about the killings in Northern Ireland, and there had been it was a lot of assassinations happening there, and it was like real personal, like people coming into
mhm,
just like it is in the movie. And he spent like 6 months there and felt like he couldn't make a narrative film that wouldn't somehow just sort of betray the seriousness of the situation
mhm, mhm.
and the real horror of the situation. So it's this real sort of like despairing film, and like you don't know who is IRA and who isn't in it.
Right.
There's
That's
no there's no signifier. So people in Ireland and the UK watching it also have there's sort of this extra charge of wait, who's the good guy and who's the bad guy here? Who's
mhm.
depending on what political side you're on. And I've been obsessed with that movie for decades, for a long time, and was really interested in how I could harness some of the energy of that and the feel of that and put that into prose and then bring something else to it, hopefully, as well.
Yeah, because it there is this feeling as it goes on because you keep at least me reading Destroy All Monsters, you keep waiting for it to not happen. You know what I mean? for it to, but it's kind of just relentless, right? It just keeps being successful time after time after time after time. So that's one of the main elephant type things that the book reminded me of, was just
Yeah, I
that,
mean,
like, it's not stopping. There's not, like, no hero stands up, right, and stops it, and no act of God stops it either. It just keeps, for the most part, happening over and over and over again.
I thought of the beginning of Side B with the killings as sort of like my speed metal opening to the book,
Sure. Right.
It was
Where it's
just
like this
like,
this montage sequence of crazy wild shit. Yeah.
yeah, like here we go. And and I did try like within that too, like I tried to build in space for people to navigate it however they wanted, because as it goes along, it starts to move further and further away from the act of violence.
Right.
Um, it doesn't make it any less creepier, I think, and maybe more so. Um, but yeah, no, I mean, Alan Clark, I'm really interested. I love his films. And I was really interested also in sort of like the single take nature of Elephant. Like each of the killings is one take, it's one long shot.
Mm-hmm.
And it's with a steady cam moving, usually following one of the killers, but not always.
Not always. That was another thing I was going to bring up, is that sometimes you don't even know who the killer is going to be, right?
Yes, right. Oh, and sometimes it's following the victim, which also happens in Destroy All Monsters in Juncture.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I was interested in like how do I get the feel of a single take?
Right.
How do I get the feel of this walking wonderful steady cam
Mm-hmm.
in prose? Because there's something about, I think he did that because you feel like you're trapped in that moment and you
Mm-hmm.
can't get out of it and you desperately want to get out of it.
Right.
And I thought it was a very interesting and sort of ethical way to treat violence.
Yeah, so that, I guess that comes back to, I mean, you're already well equipped to do that because, there's a lot of, I don't even know if love, well, I'll go with loving descriptions of, like I said, like decay and, of clubs and, of the atmosphere. There's a lot of that. So that you do have that kind of, I don't know if cinematic is right, but you do kind of paint that well.
What's also at that point too, like it really is about feeling bodies moving through space.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So space becomes important in the camera, and sort of as compared to Mira Corpora, like we need to see the space a little bit better.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's Mira Corpora is so much, it's more hallucinatory. And I knew when I was starting this book that like the hallucinatory dial was going to have to be turned down for this to work.
Right. Right.
And still have these hallucinatory moments and this ability to have this dream logic floating through the book, but not, it just, the story didn't require it to be sort of jacked up to the level it was in Mira Corpora.
Yeah, yeah. So there is just a lot of more being able to focus on, these characters and how they deal with death. And that's one of the, again, to go back to the kind of side A and side B thing, it kind of is interesting to see how, I don't know, should we just we could just talk about it, I guess. You want me to
Yeah,
put like a little.
I guess we say at this point, like if you haven't read the book, you should go buy it and read it.
Yeah,
Then come back to the
exactly.
podcast.
Right, exactly. Go buy it.
Stop
Go.
now and then, yeah, right.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so basically inside
But
B,
seriously, do that.
what's that?
But seriously, listeners should do that.
They should. They absolutely should. With all joking aside, right? So yeah, so inside B rather, what you do with that is you flip it entirely, right? So in the first part, you have Zini, right? Am I saying that correctly? I figured I was.
I say Zenny, but
Zenny.
you know.
How on earth do you get Zenny from that? It's spelled literally like genie with an X.
Because her name is Jennifer, and so it's sort of a Jen Zen.
You actually took my question seriously. I'm just joking. I'm just messing with you. So she, her boyfriend is killed, right? He's one of the victims of this plague, right? And then in side B, it's all kind of flipped around, right? And
yeah, and so what? Yeah, I mean, for me, and what made side B viable to me was I didn't want to do like the Rashomon thing, where it's just like the events seen from a different character's perspective.
right.
I really wanted to make sure that, like, the parts couldn't fit together. Like, you just couldn't do it. And if you tried to do it, you'd really hurt your head.
Well,
Um,
that's the other thing too, is that even the characters. So there are different characters who there's a different character who dies in part B, but also the characters themselves seem different, right? Like they're kind
well,
of
they
different
flip
people.
genders.
Right. Yeah, of course.
They
Yeah.
flip genders. So
Right.
Eddie becomes Edie and Florian becomes Florence.
That's right. Yeah.
And
So
they have
everything is different.
slightly different, some of them, like Eddie and Edie are both sort of managers of a band,
Mm-hmm.
but Florian is friends with Sean, Sean's oldest friend, and Florence, and both of their nicknames are Flo at different points in the book.
Right.
Florence is Zenny's oldest friend.
Mm-hmm.
So the triangulation of the relationships flips a little bit, with Eddie and Edie being sort of like more stable.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Now, why did you not want it to fit like that? Just because that's been done, or are you getting at something by making those two so square peg in a round hole, kind of?
Well, to me it's almost related to. I mean, this is where some of the supernatural and the metaphysical stuff comes in, if you want it to come in. Where I mean, it's also related to like the trapdoors in the
Mm-hmm.
book.
Mm-hmm.
There are all these trapdoors in the book, and I sort of wanted, like, when you come to side B, I wanted to, in some ways, to feel like you'd fallen through a trapdoor
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and you'd come out the other side of something else,
Mm-hmm.
and that it was. I mean, there are a couple of reasons. One was that I thought it was interesting, like what happens when different characters have died
Yeah.
and
Mm-hmm.
different characters are grieving, and what does it say about these different versions of them? What does it say about these different versions of themselves? What's the same and what's different? And it forces you to look at the relationships between all these different things. And I guess I hoped that by doing that, that would also force you to rethink a lot of the relationships and a lot of the connections and a lot of the patterning that happens inside A and that happens throughout the book. That in a certain way, the patterns are more important than the plot,
Mm-hmm.
or
That's
could be
fascinating.
more important than the plot if you want them to be. But that the patterns are very important in how meaning is created in the book, or one of the ways that meaning is created in the book. And to point that out, it was also a way because I really wanted, like, side B to, like, earn its right to be there. And so I wanted to have different character, to see sort of different shades of reactions to what was happening. And also I wanted to include scenes that weren't in side A. So side B, like side A doesn't include a funeral.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I wanted to have a formal funeral. And I wanted to see the characters, like, right when the grief is really fresh
Mm-hmm.
and the tragedy is really fresh. And you don't really see that in side A. You see them months after this has happened.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I also wanted to have an encounter with one of the killers, or maybe one of the killers. And I wanted, like, that to happen. And so that those seem to me like two important scenes that don't happen in side A,
Mm-hmm.
that I felt like could be dramatized in side B. I also wanted it to feel I want it to feel familiar, but also that, like, the echoes that you start to see from side A play out in different ways.
Mm-hmm.
And
Right.
so that, like, so there are, like, narrative surprises for you. And if you read it side B to side A, that the same thing happens. There's a
Mm-hmm.
lot of surprises for you, regardless of which side you read it from first.
Right. Right.
And that was important to sort of keep the whole thing activated.
Right. Right. That's
I
so
mean,
interesting.
it was weird because, like, I had finished side B when Twin Peaks: The Return started.
I was
Not
going
to
to bring
send
up
us.
Lynch. I was totally going to bring up when you
Well,
talked
and,
about
and I started,
trapdoors.
like,
Yeah.
and I basically finished it when this whole thing started, and I was like, oh my God, like, everyone's gonna think I just, like, totally copied this.
Right. Right.
Um,
Right.
but I did feel like a total kinship with these sort of parallel. I mean, which Lynch was doing before Twin Peaks: The Return, but he does it so much more aggressively. This idea of these parallel universes and this idea of how the same characters morph and change within
Mm-hmm.
these parallel universes.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, no, and talking when you just said the pattern is more important than the plot, I connected that with the trapdoor thing, and the first film that comes to mind, obviously, is Mulholland Drive, right?
Oh,
Um,
right, yeah, sure.
so, I mean, I'm thinking about that, and I'm thinking about the different identities, and that I read something recently that was very interesting because The common interpretation of Mulholland Drive, obviously, is that the beginning is a sort of fantasy, right? And then the second part of the film is reality, right? So
Right.
it's
Right.
it's
It's like the opposite of Lost Highway.
right, exactly. But the what I read, oh, I wish I could remember who said this, but what I was reading was that there's no real proof that both sides aren't dreams, right? That it's
Oh yeah,
actually
yeah,
that
yeah.
it's actually all a dream. And so thinking about it in terms that opened up so much for me in terms of fiction and literature in general, because so much when dreams are introduced, it's in kind of like a matrix way, you know, what's real, what's not real. Is this the real world where everything sucks, or is this the matrix where you can have superpowers, right? And the idea of that being of them both being dreams, like I like the idea of putting that on to Destroy All Monsters, right?
Or both being real.
Or both being real. Oh, I like that too. Flipped yet again. Oh, out chest by the master. But you know what I mean? The pattern
Yeah.
being more important than plot. So in side B and in side A, it's more about exploring certain patterns rather than here are the two plots and here's a diagram of how it all works with like red yarn, you know? Um,
Right.
anyway, that's just my mind being blown. I like that a lot.
Yes, I mean it's interesting because a couple of readers have said, "Oh, when I got to side B, I realized like that was the reality, the other one was a dream, or vice versa," which is fine. Like that's a
Sure.
fine interpretation. But yeah, hopefully it does exactly what you said and like complicates the idea of what's dream, what's reality, how and the idea that like it can be both, or it can be both dream and reality. And there's a reason why. I mean, the two dreams that are in the book which are written in the same sort of pattern. In side A, it's a dream that's shared by Zenny and Florian.
Mm. Mm.
And in side B, it's a dream that's apparently shared by many people. It's shared by Sean and Zenny, but in fact, it's a dream that's been circulating around that a lot of people have been having. And in a certain way, I almost thought of it as the book itself dreaming.
Mm.
And
Ah,
it's written in second person, so that in a way, you're invited into the dream, like quite literally as a reader.
you are speaking my language, man. I love the idea of the act of reading a book is actually the book's dream itself, and that the author is just this sort of interpreter to the best of your ability, right? Because side B was always there, you know, even though side A wasn't there when were shopping the book around. Side B was always there, and I just can't help but think of this, this other half of the book's dream sort of pumping the brakes on material reality, because it's like, wait a minute, hold on, like you left, like you left the kid it's like Home Alone or whatever,
Yeah.
we left Kevin at home, right?
Right. Well, also, I mean, the other thing which I haven't talked about, but since I'm divulging so many secrets here anyway,
I don't know what it is about me. People do this all the time, but yeah, go ahead.
they're good questions. You're engaging. So it's sort of if we'd been talking like really like right after the book came out, like I wouldn't be talking about half of this.
Sure, sure.
Uh, also, but a lot of the dream and at the end of side B, almost all the phrases are taken from phrases in side A.
Interesting. So there's this sort of, I'm trying to think of what to do with that. So when you say, hold on. So when you say phrases, what do you mean? Like,
Like literal, I mean like literal text fragments.
oh,
Like I
okay.
literally collaged so that it's made from this different reality. But
So,
but they're all scrambled in different orders. And I've had rewritten a few things, but like it was important to me that like it felt like a sort of summation, but also like it's also a complete reinscribing
yeah. So I noticed,
a dream of the materials in a different way.
I think I picked up on that with the Killers. I think the Killers is where that was really sort of where I recognized it, right? Where I was like, oh, that's something that I've seen before, right? Not even just scene wise, but actual like lines, maybe. I don't know,
Yeah.
but that's very interesting. So in a way, That makes
And
me wonder.
that's something that's not like it's not like important for readers to get that. That was like just for me, but it felt right to do it that way. It felt like the book wanted that.
So that's, yeah, that's what I was going to get at it. So now I'm wondering if it's less of a case um, of leaving Kevin at home, and rather was side A pregnant, right? And it just needed that gestation period to give birth to its reconstituted but very similar child, in a sense. Like B being the child of A is interesting too.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, I don't. Maybe I don't know. I'm not sure.
Hmm.
I think that's not quite right, but I'm not
Mm-hmm.
sure how it's different. But I'm
Well,
pretty sure it's different. But I don't think I could. I don't think I could unpack that right now.
well, so it's maybe it's different in the sense that if B was still floating around and just kind of waiting to be written, right, from the pieces of the other one, it gives it more of a sense of agency. And we kind of did just get done talking about how, you definitely didn't want part B to just be like either a tying up of threads or even a, wink wink nudge nudge, isn't this like part A? So maybe my sort of metaphor of it being A's child feels a little bit too derivative of,
Well, because in some ways I feel like the birth. So I guess I feel like it's written so that the birth goes both ways. And this is maybe Lynchian also, where
hmm,
side A gives birth to side B, and at the same time, while side B is birthing itself, it's actually rebirthing side A because it forces you to rethink so
mm-hmm,
much about side A.
mm-hmm,
I
mm-hmm.
mean, I thought of it in some ways of like a cassette where like you're you're both like erasing the other side and like creating something new on top of it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's both erasing it and rewriting it, and sort of like the story somewhere in between, like that the act of that happening is actually that wheel turning of both erasing and creating something new on top of it is actually what is happening.
Right, and that's interesting if you think of the two in sort of like maybe a slightly disharmonious conflict with each other. That just, what am I trying to say? I've been thinking a lot lately as the act of creation itself as obviously an act of destruction, right? So,
Sure.
and what I mean by that is that it's the cliche, right? Oh, this doesn't look the way it looked in my head. As soon as you start writing it down, you have killed it. So I have this kind of very masculine metaphor of, of writers going out into the woods and, hunting this majestic bear, right? And killing it and then skinning it and having a rug made out of it. And then people might buy that rug and put it on their floor and point at it and say like,
Right,
look,
right.
there's that thing. And that's where your beautiful thought ends up, right? Um, but what you're making me think now, what might have been done with something like Destroy All Monsters, is that if it's two acts of destruction, but that have been sort of turned in on each other, right? Like two Furbies talking to each other for eternity, right? Like in that way, they're replicating the creation and destruction act of the writing of the book itself.
Yeah, I think it's related to what happens toward the end of Mira Corpora, where the narrator talks about how to end a story, and it is by erasing each word
Mm-hmm.
one by one and sort of creating the new text with the sharpened point of your eraser.
Mm-hmm.
That there's something about the creation and destruction that's actually happening simultaneously.
Mm-hmm.
That it's in fact, I don't know, it's almost like not what's being created, but it's like the turning of that motor and that impulse is both you know uh, killing the bear and skinning it, or I don't, that's not the right way to say it. um, but yeah, it's something about that enacting that motion, maybe,
Okay.
if that makes sense. I don't think it does.
No, it does. It does. I'm just thinking about, yeah, I'm thinking in terms of it being a, I'm also thinking about it being a book about music,
Yeah.
which is an extremely difficult thing to do, right? Because music, but I don't know. Is music really more ephemeral than reading is? I don't know. Maybe. But hold on. I got like 8 thoughts going on. Focus, David. So it being a book about music and how to sort of capture that, it being structured as this sort of perpetual creation and destruction machine might encapsulate, encage, perhaps, a certain energy that you otherwise would have to go to a live concert to get.
Yeah, I mean, I did, to bring it back to music in a slightly different way, maybe more pedestrian way, is
Okay,
like I
sure.
was also thinking about like structuring this somewhat musically in terms of trying to get some of those, like I said, like the opening of side B almost having a speed metal feel or
Mm-hmm,
whatever.
mm-hmm.
Like trying to capture some of the rhythms of music and trying to capture a sort of musicality in it and to capture some of the different energy and like the weird tonalities these sometimes like really great songs bring on, where you're sort of like, I'm not sure how exactly I feel about this. I'm like elated and melancholy, or I'm, whatever it is,
Mm-hmm.
sad and horny. I'm, whatever, like these conflicting things that are
Uh-huh.
being
Yeah.
generated in you at the same time that can happen. And I think that music's so great at generating these conflicting emotions in you simultaneously very quickly,
Right.
at its best. And so I was also interested in like trying to get some of that musical energy in here to create some of these maybe hopefully sort of conflicting weird tonal things that are happening, and also just to sort of charge the prose and the pleasure of the reading of it, and the story.
Well, yeah, and I think also, I mean, there's pleasure in just reading your prose anytime, to give you a compliment there. Uh, you're one of the best, dude. But he's like, one of the best, motherfucker. I am the best.
No,
Uh, but no,
it's not.
but again, that kind of brings it back to this idea of, you're talking about how music makes you feel two things at once. So I think that when people read something or when they listen to something and they feel two things at once, if they take those two things and go make something with those conflicting feelings, that's how art kind of proliferates and spreads. That's how it becomes sort of viral in a way, right? And so this is not kind of neither here nor there, but I was thinking about, I don't know, I guess criticism of music and books and how a lot of it just doesn't do anything for me anymore. But it might be the art's fault. It might not. I think maybe a little bit of both. But anyway, my point is that, when you create something like this book, for example, or like a particular album that you like a lot, sometimes that can produce writing or films inspired by those things that are equal to or even better than the work itself. Kind of brings me back to, I guess, Mark Fisher, who writes about music that I actually probably wouldn't listen to for the most part. I'm not a huge Goldie fan. I don't know if you are.
Mm, I'm not either. I think you have to be British to like Goldie. That's my operating theory on
Yeah.
Goldie, actually.
Right, right. Totally. No, I agree. But so I guess what I'm just kind of saying is that what I love about this book and also other things like it, these kind of generative by way of being destructive pieces of art, is that I think that they're better than self-help books for going out and creating your own stuff, right? Because I think you spend a little bit of time with a sort of captured energy. To bring it back to my, you brought it back to the very like practical, like this is what I was doing, and then I'm like, but what about magic and spirit, blah blah blah. But I'm just gonna cut myself off there because I think I gave you about 8 thoughts. I'm not sure if any of that made sense, but
No, no, it all makes sense. And I
okay.
do, I mean, in terms of music, I've often thought about like what are, what are the type of bands or musical acts that sort of act like a spore that infects other people to make other great art, and what are the bands and the musicians who are sort of terminal acts, who sort of done what they do as well as they can be done, and to copy them is just to end up being, there's certain forms of art that I think like open up pathways for others, and there are
Mm-hmm.
others that sort of like are sort of like the summit of what they do. I don't
Mm-hmm.
think I don't think one is worse than the other, but I've always been more interested in sort of like the Velvet Underground idea of like only 10,000 people bought that record, but they all formed a band or
Yes.
whatever.
Yes. Right.
That it opens up pathways for people to follow down than sort of like Led Zeppelin or the Beatles, who if you try and copy them, you just become pale imitations of them and, you just look foolish. To use like classic rock examples. But I mean, I think there's true in like, electronic music where something, to bring it back to hauntology, something like Boards of Canada is a very generative band, very generative electronic act that opened up all these pathways and possibilities for people to follow. And I think I think that sort of art is exciting. I don't know that as an artist you get to choose what sort of artist you are.
Sure, of course, yeah.
But I do like that. And I do like the idea of art sort of being a spore that goes and infects someone else to go create something, because that's how art has worked for me. Like, just like talking about the Alan Clark, for example, or, any number of writers or films or music or whatever, that's been so important in terms of like, it's made me want to make art. Like going to see the jazz pianist Cecil Taylor play was really like a reminder of like, if you want to make art, like here's the level, like here's the bar, like what this guy is doing is like he sits at the piano and he transforms the entire room with his energy. And it's unbelievable. I've never seen anyone really at that level do that. And it was like, it's somewhat terrifying in terms of like how on earth can anyone do this?
Sure,
but
yeah.
it's also like, it's also amazing that a human being did this. This can, this sort of thing can be accomplished by human beings. And that's an exciting.
If you were to speculate on it, what do you think some of those elements might have been?
With Cecil in particular?
Yeah. With that particular experience.
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting with Cecil, like the way he would always start his shows, he's a jazz pianist, and he would make his way out to the piano, and he wouldn't just come out and start playing. He would come out and he would have these sort of like, he'd have this little ritual of coming to the piano. And sometimes it'd be doing a little bit of dance, sometimes it'd be reciting this sort of poetry he'd written or whatever. And I know a lot of people really felt that like this part of Cecil's art was like embarrassing. Oh, Cecil's coming out and he's sort of sort of moving around the piano a little bit, reciting a little bit of like Jewish poetry and what the fuck. But to me, it was about he knew that he couldn't just sit down and play, that this was like a really important, it was like respecting the power of the piano and the power of the music. And he had to, in front of us as an audience, and sometimes this would just last 10 seconds, but sometimes it would last 3 or 4 minutes, depending on what his energy was and what the energy of the room was, that he needed to like, this was a serious thing he was about to do and plug into. And when he did, there was so much, he was so in the moment, and he clearly like rehearsed. I saw him play at Lincoln Center, this 3-hour solo concert. He apparently had rehearsed for it for like 5 months. He was like insane. But it felt like it was being created for you right there, because it was. And there was so much joy and play, and just to watch his expression, the delight on his face as he was find these notes. And he would play with his forearms and his fists.
Oh, wow.
I mean, just really like intense, sometimes just noisy passages where he would just beat, he would only play these Bosendorfer pianos, which had an extra bass octave. And he would sometimes just beat the shit. Like the early days of the pianos when he would play, literally keys would fly off because he would play them so hard.
Oh, wow.
But he also had this incredibly delicate touch. And when it needed to be delicate, it could be just as incredibly delicate as it needed to be. And when he needed to play with his forearms just to create these gales of noise and dissonance, he would do that.
And
that everything was available to him. And all of it was a delight to discover it in the moment. And it just that sense of commitment and that sense of, I don't know, like you could feel all the work in a certain sense that had gone into it, both sort of artistically and technically and spiritually. but it was also carried so lightly, and it was presented to you in this really delightful way. But it was also like you either were like in there with Cecil, and like literally, what I loved about him watching him is your sense of time would disappear, and he could have been playing for 20 minutes, or it could have been 2.5 hours. It was really hard to tell. But you were either in it all the way and like having your life transformed, or you'd be there 20 minutes and you just have to run screaming from the hall.
Oh wow.
There was no middle point. Like literally, you could not sit there with like your hand on your chin and be like, "That's fascinating." Like no, like it
Right.
really like the energy was so intense that you either had to like go for it and be in it, or you had to leave. And people would leave his shows in droves.
Huh.
But there was something very primal about what he was doing too, and it really connected. I actually the one of the first times I saw him when he was playing at Lincoln Center, I was just out of college. I couldn't afford the ticket; it was way too expensive. And so I talked my dad into taking me as a father-son outing. He had seen this really straight-ahead jazz pianist with me years before, and had really enjoyed that. So I'm like, "It's just like that, Dad. Come and like." So he would buy my ticket for this Lincoln Center show, assuming he was just going to hate it and he would probably walk out, but I get to see the show. Um, and he loved it.
Oh wow.
And he was really like, he didn't have much context for it, but like because he was willing to enter into it and was totally transformed by it. And I saw Cecil Taylor with my dad like another 5 or 6 times.
Hmm. That's amazing. There's a lot to pick apart in there. There's talking about like, technique and dedication, but also tapping into the primal, and the ability to find things. I love the idea of him finding it, like if they're floating out there somewhere, and he's like,
It
oh,
felt like it. Yeah,
there's
to
that.
watch him, it felt like I'm sure these were passages he's rehearsed a lot, but it wasn't like he's trying to hit the notes, you
Mm-hmm.
know?
Mm-hmm.
It was like he's siphoning these marvelous gales of sound.
Yeah. It
And
kind.
he was someone who also understood that there was no difference between the primal and between like this incredible complexity.
Hmm.
That he was drawing on Ellington and all this, and Henry Cowan, all this 20th century music, and also was a big fan of Marvin Gaye and soul and all this other stuff. And but like there's all this. He was wielding massive amounts of information, but also able to like tap into the primalness of that at the same time.
Hmm. That makes me think of I don't know, actually probably of a lot of my favorite artists, especially musical. To not in jazz, but in terms of rap.
Mm-hmm.
Um, in rap, a lot of like one of my favorite artists is this guy Lil B. I don't know if
Oh,
you ever,
sure.
yeah, but
Okay.
Lil B is somebody who you know um, can technically rap if he so chose to do so,
Right.
but he's very typically working with these very strange kind of avant-garde beats, and he does what he calls based freestyle. So there's this kind of like when people hear it, it's the same. That's the same energy, maybe that I don't know if maybe runs screaming. I think they might. There's a lot more sort of casual snobbish dismissal instead of like, ugh, that's
Oh,
terrible. Like,
yeah. When Cecil was dismissed, like unbelievable,
right, right,
throughout his entire life,
right, and
and
it's
he
like,
lived to be 90.
oh Jesus, and and he just kept going. That's so inspiring too, though, because Lil B is like very similar in that way, where to be so to know that there are probably 500,000 people who hate your guts, right? Because of this thing that you've chosen to do. And to keep going has to be some kind of mental fortitude that I don't have. But to kind of like just wrap that up on my end, it's because he knows technically what he's doing and he understands music. And it's once you get to that point, you're allowed to sort of like go back and break the rules. And sometimes I think to some people, they can't tell the difference between the amateur and the professional who's like come out the other side. You know what I mean?
Right. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Cecil Taylor had a great quote about. He said, "Musicians are many, but people who change the urgency and the size of the music as we know it are few.
Hmm.
And to me, Cecil, seeing him was one of these people who changed the urgency and the size of what art could do.